Okay, so before we get into talking about specific strategies for coping with stress, I'd like to provide some definitions for coping and also some ways that researchers have grouped the various mechanisms and strategies for coping into different types. So first, to give a definition of coping, by now you know I love a formal definition. So coping has been defined as the strategies that individuals use to manage distressing problems and emotions in our lives. It's also been defined as the thoughts and behaviors that we use to manage internal and external demands. You can see there the language from our transactional model of stress, right? We're thinking about the demands of the environment as well as the demands that might be coming from within ourselves, the pressures that we put on ourselves, our anxiety, the way that we see a situation. So our coping is our ways that we try to change that and manage the demands that we experience from our environment or from within ourselves. Coping is importantly, it's a dynamic process, right? We often talk about coping as if it's just one thing and you can, cope, but coping is something we have to do on an ongoing basis over time. And so it's not a one-time reaction, rather it's an ongoing process. It's a dynamic process. And importantly, coping in the literature on coping encompasses everything from individual differences in personality and temperament that lead people to be able to cope better or worse with stress. That's less of what we're covering here, although that's certainly interesting. Here we're talking more about how specific coping strategies can help us all to become better at coping with stress. And so even if you're neurotic like I am and easily stressed out, there's still things that we can do to manage our stress better. And so this is what we'll be talking about in terms of coping today. The things we can do to shift our perception internally of the demands of our situation or our resources to cope with that, or actually to shift what's actually happening in the environment to change those demands and to lessen them. And certainly also coping is very heavily studied in the literature on emotions specifically, and so there they'll talk a lot about coping with specific emotions of like anger or sadness, but here we're really talking about coping with stress, and so again really focused on the demands that are facing us and our appraisals of those and how we handle those. So broadly speaking, we can think of two types of coping. You've probably learned about these in other classes. We can think of problem-focused coping and emotion-focused coping. So problem-focused coping is really focused on those external demands in the environment, right? Problem-focused coping is directed outward at those demands at the environment, and so the goal here is to deal directly with the stressor by reducing its demand or by increasing one's resources for meeting those demands. And so we'll give some more examples in additional slides, but one clear example of this that might feel relevant now is the midterm comes up. A problem-focused coping mechanism for dealing with this with the stress of an upcoming exam would be to do additional studying, to come up with questions, to ask at the review session, maybe find a virtual study buddy, things that can help to both decrease the demands of the situation. You could gain a better understanding of what you're going to have to do so that doesn't feel so anxiety-provoking, or you could also increase your resources, right, by learning the material better. And so this would be a problem-focused coping way of dealing with that anxiety and stress. Could also engage in emotion-focused coping, and this would be directed inward. And so this would be attempts to try to control your own emotional response to the stressor. And we'll talk about a lot of ways that we can do this, but perhaps with the upcoming test, again, it's not exams in this class, these are assessments. So, but say you had an exam, or say you have an assessment that's coming up. You might try to calm yourself down. You might try to meditate and try to relax. You might try to think about that in a different way. As we'll see, we could talk about trying to think about things that are anxiety-provoking as more exciting, perhaps. I know that might seem weird in the situation of a test, but again, this is something that we can do to try to change the way that we are experiencing a stressor, but we're not actually changing what's occurring in the environment. We're changing what's happening within ourselves. So some examples of problem-focused coping, right? These would be things like engaging in a direct action to mitigate the source of stress, right? So trying to change the situation. And so this will look different depending on the problem that you're trying to cope with, right? It's going to look different for a test than if you're trying to cope with this the stress of perhaps your home is infested with rats, for example. This is kind of a random example, but then the way that you would want to deal with that, if you would want to get rid of the rats, you'd want to hire somebody to come and do that. You might want to go out and buy some traps to catch them. You might want to close off any entrances to your home. These would be ways to get rid of the source of that stress, right? So in this way, it's very clear in this example, the source of the stress is this infestation in your home, and you want to get rid of that. And so problem-focused coping can work very well when there is a clear problem to address. It can also look like seeking accurate information, right? So in the example of the upcoming assessment, maybe you're feeling really anxious because you think you only have 3 hours to do it, but actually you could find out from the question and answer board on our discussion on our Quirkus site, or from emailing the professor, that you actually have 72 hours, and so this could give you some more information to work with, and really it doesn't change the actual situation of the test, but you used to think the test was a different thing, and now you know accurately what it is, and so you have a more accurate perception of the situation and a more accurate stress response in relation to that. You also might seek help or advice. You might try to have others in the class who study with you. You might ask the TA or myself some questions, and this would be a way to gain more resources, right? And so a way to cope with the problem that is in front of you. So you can get help from someone. You might come up with a plan, right, in order to tackle the problem, whether that's the rats or whether you're studying for a test that's coming up. And you might also cope with that problem by postponing other activities that are interfering and also taking up your time, so that you have more energy to cope with the thing that is facing you as the most pressing stressor. So these are all problem-focused methods of coping. And again, these are going to vary depending on what the problem is that you're coping with, right? Because you're trying to directly address that issue. We also have emotion-focused coping, and so this is things like making and maintaining socially supportive and empathic ties. We're going to talk more about this towards the end of this lecture. It could be seeking spiritual support or trying to process the difficult emotions, or you're trying to make sense of what's going on and the stress that you're experiencing. You might seek out support from a spiritual leader around that to give you advice. This could help manage the feelings that you're experiencing. Oops. You might also engage in reframing or cognitive restructuring, or as we call it in this literature, reappraisal. And again, this is also something we're going to talk more in depth about in this lecture, but you could try to see the situation in a different way and change your thinking about that. And so this is a way of trying to change your emotions through changing your thinking. And so this is a form of emotion-focused coping. Also, relaxation and various exercises around that, and breathing exercises as well as exercise can be a good way to help to cope with our emotions, and we'll talk about both of these as well in more depth. So, emotion-focused coping. And all of these so far have been functional forms of emotion-focused coping, but there are also maladaptive forms of emotion-focused coping. And these could be things like, you don't want to deal with the emotions, so you try to avoid them in some way, maybe by denial and wishful thinking, and you pretend that this isn't really happening. And so, for that upcoming assessment, you're anxious about it, and so you just push that away, and you say, that's not really going to be so bad, or that's not really happening for a long time, even though it's coming up soon. And so you engage in that kind of process, and it helps you to feel less anxious in the moment. But you can imagine that's not going to be very adaptive in the long term, because eventually you do need to deal with whatever the source of the stress is. Other things could be eating, drugs, or alcohol, and I'm not saying you can never do these things, but when we use them as an escape from dealing with the source of stress, this can be a very maladaptive way, especially if we do it to excess, right? If we do it too much and it's at the level where it becomes a health hazard, and you're using it to not manage your emotions and not cope with things that's going on in your life, then that's going to be maladaptive emotion-focused coping. Aggression is also one, right? So if you're taking out your stress on other people through aggressive words or acts, that's also maladaptive, and I don't think I need to convince you why. I'm going to stop there, and then we'll pick up next with reappraisal, our first specific coping strategy that we're going to talk about.